Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to enter the entire Trump Project 2025 into the record so that the American people can have it at their disposal for reference for this hearing.
Very good. I don't think anyone on this side's ever read that, but apparently you all have, so we'll enter it into the record without objection. So ordered.
Thank you so much. And again, I just appreciate the transparency of this particular committee, because last week, right after the debate, we tried to enter it into the record in the House Natural Resources Committee, and 3 members on the GOP side of the aisle actually objected to putting it in the record. And I have to say, we were genuinely shocked, because I've never seen an objection to a UC to put evidence in the record. But it was very clear in that hearing that the GOP was trying to distance themselves from this document. So, you know, I think it's interesting that we're here today, where we've got the authors of the document, and I just want to say welcome to the American people to your campaign stop on the Donald Trump campaign. Here we are in the Oversight Committee, and we've got a bunch of former Trump and current Trump officials. We've got authors of Project 2025, which is the blueprint for the next presidential transition. And the last stop for the Trump campaign was the House floor last night, because Donald Trump asked the House GOP leadership to put a CR on the floor that they knew was not going to pass, that had a voter bill attached to it, and then he told everyone to vote against it.
In May of 2022, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit affirmed a lower court's decision revoking an approved mine plan for the Rosemont Copper Mine project in Arizona. Essentially, this court's ruling puts the cart before the horse and fails to reflect the process of how a company actually develops a mine. If allowed to stand, the Rosemont decision would require the discovery and determination of a valid mineral deposit, meaning that operators must prove the existence of a commercially developable deposit on a claim before a plan of operations can be approved.
Why the heck are we back on the House floor 1 week? Yeah, that's right. 1 week after we voted on a bipartisan basis to send this bad bill back to committee, because it couldn't even be supported on the floor once. But yet here we are, and our friends are trying to pass it once again without revision, without changes, because they think they found a few extra spare votes. This bill is not about clarifying a court decision. It's about giving more minerals away to those who would like unfettered access to our public lands. It would give the opportunity for multinational corporations and adversarial nations to control even more of our resources without having to pay royalties to the U.S. government and to tie up claims on our public lands, whether or not there are minerals actually present there. I share my colleague AOC's just absolute shock a few moments ago. If you roll back the tape, I saw something. I have worked in the federal government for over a decade, and I have never seen anyone object to a unanimous consent to put evidence into the record.
Chairman, may I ask for a unanimous consent request, please? Since Mr. Graves has invited it, I think this is probably a good time to enter all 920 pages of of Trump's Project 2025 into the record. Where you can see on page 61, for example, the call for giving project proponents more control over regulatory clocks, page 524, for example, which rescinds the Biden rules and reinstates Trump rules under CEQ reforms. For NEPA, page 533, for example, where the Department of Interior is mandated to reinstate secretarial orders under the Trump administration, including time and page limits on NEPA documents, page 533, for example, where consideration of eliminating judicial review and the challenges to the adequacy of NEPA documents, it goes on, and I would request unanimous
Reserving
consent.
the right to object.
I object also.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. Chairman, I have a question. How many trees would it take to print that? I'm just...
And they didn't even print the secret fourth pillar that's their radical emergency orders for the first 180 days. It's a great question.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Withdraw.
I think President Trump and his campaign has denied any dealings with 2025. Last night he said in the debate that he never has read it, nor does he want to read it. So to say
he says
that
some
is
parts
Trump,
are good.
Excuse me, I've got the floor. To say that this is his project, I think is wrong, and it's wrong to enter it into the records.
Mr. Chairman, this is about this committee, not even waiting for Donald Trump, actually proceeding now to implement parts of Project 2025. I can't imagine anything more relevant given the subject matter of this hearing, so I will request unanimous consent to enter it into the record so we can demystify this for Mr. Graves and others who seem to think that there's not a direct line.
So is there objection to entering the 2025 report that is not the Trump report as stated by Mr. Huffman?
Just written by Trump's complete inner circle, but yes.
There is objection.
I hope people will take note of that. I've never seen that before. And we had multiple members object to putting Project 2025 in the record today. And what's shocking about that, truly shocking, is first of all, it doesn't even have to be in the record, you guys. It's online. You can just Google it. It's right here. And if you read it, AOC actually read from page 61 of this report, which was written by Donald Trump's OMB director. The section on CEQ is specifically about the provisions that are in the bills that are on this agenda today. It literally is calling for the things that are in this bill. That is literally what it says. You can read it. It's right here online. And not only does it say that it should implement what Donald Trump did during his administration, it says right here on page 61 it should go further. It says that it should use the judicial review that the Supreme Court just put into place by overturning Chevron deference to make it possible for the administration to go further. So when my friends across the aisle, and I respect and I want to work with you all on a bipartisan basis, say that Project 2025 has nothing to do with what's happening here today, it has everything to do with what's happening here today because it's all right here in this document. So I'm just genuinely shocked. I hope people will replay the clip over and over again of the objection that just happened here a few moments ago, because I have never seen that happen. I rise today in opposition not only to this rule, but the bills that it advances. And I have to say that I am amazed daily by the debates that I hear in this chamber and in our committees, and outraged that the GOP is using the floor to advance a hateful agenda to take away voting rights and to advance insane legislation. Because 1 week after we celebrated this great nation's independence, we are here today as they're putting forward legislation to protect our kitchen appliances. That's right, folks. Running bills on the floor entitled "The Freedom of Refrigerators" and "Dignity for Dishwashers." I'm not making this up. These are the real names of the bills that they're running this week. Because apparently, they're more concerned about the freedom of our refrigerator than the freedom to make decisions about our own bodies. They're more concerned about our dishwashers than they are about democracy. And they're more concerned about appliances than an autocrat who is seeking re-election, who says he wants to be a dictator on day one. So I ask my colleagues, honestly, how do you do this with a straight face? Because y'all, this ain't normal. This is insane. Is this the freedom and democracy that our country fought for? Arguing for kitchen appliances? Is this what your constituents are telling you? Because mine are telling me that they're terrified about the future of this country and about their families and their rights. They're asking us to fight to protect LGBTQ rights and abortion, to address climate change, to lower costs, to protect voting rights. And you're over here asking us to vote on a bill to protect the rights of dishwashers and refrigerators. It's insane. So I'm just like at a loss. It's time to wake up. It's time to get to work. It's time to serve the American people, because literally our democracy depends on it. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The chair would once again like to remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of president, and also to direct their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Texas is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2925 and would like to remind my friends across the aisle that mining is already happening on American lands and on our public lands. But this week, instead of working on meaningful legislation on behalf of the American people, our friends have opted instead to focus on a toxic free-for-all on our public lands, have opted to focus on legislation to roll back energy efficiency in home appliances. In fact, they put forward a bill this week called Hands Off Our Home Appliances because they're so concerned about the American people that they want to regulate the efficiency of your toasters, your dishwashers, your refrigerators, and undermine the ability of our immigrant and our Hispano communities to have representation in the United States Senate and United States Census, and yes, to allow a free-for-all on our public lands. Now, the American people are not asking us to do this. They are asking us to work on real problems, to work on the economy, inflation, helping families put food on the table and a roof over their head, protecting our reproductive rights and access to the ballot box, protecting our democracy, and dealing with the international crises that are happening on multiple continents. Let's talk about mining laws. The existing mining law of 1872 already gives our mining companies, including foreign-owned companies, the right to extract on our publicly owned lands. They can also do so without having to pay even 1 cent in royalties. That includes companies that are controlled by governments of adversarial nations. This is not only a shameful giveaway, but a huge national security vulnerability for the United States. This would make it impossible to invalidate a mining claim, even if their real intent was other things, maybe to lock up development of other uses or buying them for other uses, including construction of transmission lines or other things that they would want to do. This should be of deep concern to anyone who does not want adversarial nations or the companies that operate in them to control our public lands or minerals. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle argue that it's either mine here or mine abroad and create a false equivalency, but it's not that simple. Some of the countries that are trying to expand their mining operations here in the United States, in fact, many of these multinational corporations, are owned as subsidiaries under countries like China and other countries that we have adversarial relationships with. They also engage in practices that we know cause human rights abuses, things like slave labor elsewhere in the world. And while my friends across the aisle have tried to claim that this is really about mining on American lands, it's about granting unfettered access to these corporations. In fact, these entities can ship the minerals that they take from American lands anywhere in the world and smelt those materials on the cheap, also relying on human rights abuses abroad to cut costs. Now, as I said, we already had this debate last week, and the outcome was that the entire House, right here on this floor, voted to send this toxic bill back to the Natural Resources Committee. In fact, that hadn't happened in years because this bill was so flawed and such a giveaway to foreign national-owned companies and a threat to our national security that it was agreed that it wasn't ready for prime time and shouldn't be passed on the floor. My colleague from New Mexico, Representative Teresa Ledger Fernandez, offered a motion to send the bill back to committee so that we could discuss amending the bill to ban these adversarial corporations operated in adversarial nations from mining and locking up our public lands. And I have to say, I was heartened. We had 6 Republicans join the Democrats to do just that, who said, you know what, we're not going to vote for this bill. Well, it's about time. We need some bipartisan support to double down in protecting U.S. interests. In fact, as I said, it's been decades since the House sent a bill back to committee like that. But as we see today, here we are, and Republican leadership is trying once again to get the bill passed through brute force without addressing serious concerns, without sending it back to committee, without going through due process, And here we are debating it, about to take a vote again. Now, these concerns aren't new. Last year, the bill was included in H.R. 1, and at that time, one of my Republican colleagues offered a very similar amendment, banning mining on our public lands by foreign companies with records of human rights violations. And we're literally talking about companies that have child slave labor records. But that amendment passed through committee on bipartisan basis, but yet they stripped it out and are trying to pass the bill without it here today on the floor. So I just find it absolutely jaw-dropping and extremely telling that this was the amendment that was stripped out of the bill, that we're here back a week later after this bill failed on the floor. And I think it's very clear what is going on here. This is really about advancing the interests of corporations, of interests on our public lands, and opening them up for exploitation. So I think it's important that we talk about how outrageous this is. We have to ensure that our public lands are not open to our adversaries, to these multinational corporations that will exploit our minerals for free. And we need some bipartisan action to make sure that that cannot happen. We should be back in committee discussing the vulnerabilities, discussing the national security implications, discussing American competitiveness, discussing energy policy, not trying to jam through a bill that will violate human rights and international trade. And with that, I reserve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it is always an interesting adventure here in Congress, and especially this morning in this unexpectedly spicy hearing. You know, as a water resources professional, I spent my entire career working to make sure our communities have access to clean water and a sustainable future. So I was expecting to come into this hearing this morning to talk about NEPA, to talk about the importance of making sure that our communities have a seat at the table as we're developing infrastructure and decisions are being made on their behalf and with their consent. You know, I heard some conversation this morning about the need, obviously, for expediting infrastructure. We all support building infrastructure for our communities. That is why we passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill in the fall of 2021. But unfortunately, it was bipartisan, but many of the people in this room did not vote for it. But I spend a lot of my time when I'm back home in New Mexico working across the aisle with my community partners to get that infrastructure built. It's water pipelines, it's broadband, and that was made possible because of the visionary leadership in the Congress that happened before this and by President Biden and Kamala Harris. Let's talk about NEPA for a moment. NEPA was put into place in the late 1960s. It passed and then was signed by President Nixon. It was signed and passed on a bipartisan basis. Now, I just heard a comment about how Democrats have broken trust over the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Okay, y'all, we're about to take a vote on a CR today that breaks trust on the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It actually violates the handshake deal that was made with the president over your desire to tank the economy, to shrink the budget, to take away resources, and through which you shoved through a NEPA bill that tried to gut environmental regulations. So if you want to talk about breaking trust, let's talk about that, because you're about to take a vote on a bill. And if you don't want to break trust, how about you vote for a CR to keep the government operational? But NEPA was put there as public trust to support our communities, because as Mr. Beard has pointed out in his testimony, our communities were systematically excluded across the country in opportunities for economic advancement, for meaningful jobs, and were often used in siting and putting infrastructure that not only did not benefit them, but directly harmed them. And that is why the Biden administration, and that is why the soon-to-be Harris administration includes consideration of cumulative impacts, because our communities deserve a chance to have a seat at the table. They deserve the opportunity to have economic development, and they deserve to have the opportunity to build a future that they believe in. And that's what this administration's about. It's about what the Democratic leadership of this Congress is trying to advance. It's what those of us on this side of the aisle are trying to do to help our communities. And I'm frankly just shocked by some of the rhetoric I hear around this dais today. You had a bite at the apple. You tried to tank our economy over it. You got what you wanted, and now you're back here asking for more? Well, our community's lives are on the line. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and to clarify the record, Ms. Stansbury, I'm not sure if you were here when the Project 2025 report was accepted to the record. I think the objection was to something called the Trump Project 2025 report, which if you or Mr. Huffman or anybody else can produce that report, a legitimate report that's not been photoshopped, then we would probably more than likely unanimously accept that to the record too.
Mr. Chairman, I respect that, and I have deep respect for you as well, but I think you can replay the tape, and that is not what was objected to, so thank you.
We could argue about that, but we will move on.
And for the record, Mr. Chairman, I've had Democrats object to my UC request last Congress when they were in charge. Yield back.
All right, well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to say welcome and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I respect it takes a lot to put yourself out there to come and testify in front of Congress, and I know that some of this ground has been covered before, and I really do appreciate the transparency that all of you have brought about your backgrounds, about your positions, and about your perspectives on the policy issues. But just to kind of put it all in one place, I want to quickly go through, and I'm going to mostly state it. I'll ask some questions as we go. Mr. Carr, I know you've said this has been asked and answered several times, but just, going back, we know you're currently serving in the FTC. You've been serving there since 2017, since Donald Trump appointed you, and you are the author of the FCC chapter of 2025, Project 2025, correct? It's just a yes or no.
Well, so just to be clear,
Yes, you are. Thank you. I appreciate it. Mr.
chapter that you
Krikorian.
reference was done in my personal capacity
Yes.
after
The
getting
answer is a yes. Yes, Mr.
clearance from the
Krikorian,
ethics council. I just want to clarify that wasn't in my official
Mr.
capacity.
Krikorian, you serve as the ED of the Center for Immigrant Studies. You are also on the advisory board of Project 2025. Your organization has been actually designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Dr. Hobbs, thank you for your service to this country. I understand you're a veteran and an academic. I do very much respect your background and your work. You're involved in the Independent Women's Forum, which is also involved in Project 2025. You've had a number of authors and contributors from the Women's Forum that are participants in Project 2025. And Ms. Gunasekara, I know we've already covered this, but you're a former chief of staff for the Trump administration at the EPA, and I think you've been very clear about your role in drafting the EPA section of Project 2025. So I think it's very clear this hearing is actually about Project 2025. We've seen over the last almost 2 years how leadership has used this committee essentially as a campaign resource. They tried to impeach Joe Biden, they tried to impugn his family, and now here we are, and we are just 48 days, 47 days until the election, and now they're trying to attack Kamala Harris and use the resources of this committee and to platform future Trump administration officials and their agenda, and to try to normalize what are frankly very extreme policies. And we heard from one of the witnesses today that in fact, not only do they support dismantling our federal government, but would support doing even more damage than was done during the Trump administration and even what is recommended inside of this book. So, it's an interesting adventure here always. But I do want to take the remainder of my time to talk about, since there have been some unfounded and unfactual attacks on the current administration, to say that this administration has been one of the single most important administrations in American history in rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, in tackling the climate crisis, in defending our rights, in making sure that our country can function after a historic pandemic. And I think we all look forward to the continued leadership under the next administration in that way. So with that, I yield back.